Everyone believed the billionaire's daughter had been born completely blind. No one questioned it. Not the doctors, not the press, not even her own father. Jonathan King wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. A tech billionaire who changed the face of online education, Jonathan had spent the early 2000s building an empire, and the rest of his life trying to forget why. After the tragic death of his wife during childbirth, he disappeared from the public eye and moved into a sprawling estate in Old Greenwich, Connecticut. There, behind wrought iron gates and manicured gardens, he raised their only child, Lauren, a girl diagnosed with congenital blindness just hours after her birth. Doctors had warned him immediately. Her optic nerves were severely underdeveloped. She would never see, never focus, never perceive the world beyond vague shadows. Jonathan accepted that diagnosis, not because he understood it, but because he had to. It gave shape to his grief, a reason, a verdict, something to hold on to when everything else had slipped away. By age 7, Lauren was a ghost in her own home. She didn't speak, she didn't play. She sat for hours in the same chair by the parlor window, clutching a worn blue teddy bear, unmoving. The house was cold despite its grandeur. Elegant furniture, tall windows, gold chandeliers, none of it mattered. The rooms echoed with silence. Staff kept their distance. Specialists came and went. Therapies were tried. Medications were adjusted. But nothing changed. Jonathan watched it all in quiet torment. Every morning, he guided Lauren through her routine with careful precision. Every evening, he read to her from a leather-bound storybook describing the world she could never see. And every night, he whispered into the dark, asking questions no one could answer. Until one day, everything began to shift, because that was the day Grace Ellison stepped through the front doors of the King estate. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let me take you to the house where it all began. The house didn't look like it kept secrets. From the outside, it was flawless. Grey stone archways framed by hedges, trimmed like museum pieces. Windows tall and spotless, glittering like mirrors. A circular driveway lined with sleek black cars. But inside, the air felt heavy. Not haunted, just quiet, pressed down. Jonathan King kept his world carefully arranged, every clock synced, every curtain drawn just so. The staff spoke only when spoken to. Nothing felt accidental. He didn't speak of his wife, Alison. He didn't invite guests. He didn't attend events. He simply stayed, quietly orbiting the small, solemn child who sat alone in the sunroom. Lauren King was always dressed neatly, soft dresses, brushed hair, white socks pulled high. But she never smiled, never looked up. She would sit on her green velvet chair, legs curled beneath her, hugging her bear with both arms. Her face was expressionless, tilted ever so slightly toward the light, but her eyes never focused. That was how Grace found her. Grace Ellison was 26, tall, composed, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much in too little time. She arrived by bus, suitcase in hand, the weight of her own grief tucked deep inside her chest. She wasn't looking to be part of anyone's story. She just needed work and a place to breathe. The job posting had been simple: live-in housekeeper, private residence, confidential employer, good pay. Grace had seen it taped to a bulletin board at her church. She applied without much thought. When she arrived for the interview, Jonathan answered the door himself. He looked exhausted. Crisp suit, but sunken eyes. His voice was polite, but guarded. "You've worked with children?" he asked. "I've cared for family," she replied. He didn't press. He just nodded once and showed her inside. The house was pristine but sterile. Not a picture out of place, not a smudge on the floor. As Grace followed him past the parlor, she saw her for the first time. A little girl in a red cotton dress, sitting motionless by the window. Her head was slightly turned, eyes open but unseeing. She didn't react as they passed. Grace said nothing. But something in her paused. It wasn't pity. It was something quieter. A pull. A stillness inside the stillness. Jonathan showed her to the guest quarters, explained the routines, the kitchen hours, the cleaning schedule. "I don't expect much," he said finally. "Just consistency." Grace nodded. She could do consistency. That night, after unpacking, she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the ceiling. She hadn't expected to feel anything, but that little girl with the worn bear, she'd stirred something. Not sadness, not even curiosity. Just the feeling you get when you walk into a room and something's been left unfinished. The next morning, Grace rose early, dressed in quiet clothes, tied her braids back. She started with the second-floor hallway, polished the stair rail, dusted the bookshelves. By noon, she made her way to the parlor. Lauren was in the same chair, same red dress, same bear. Grace moved silently, careful not to disturb. She wiped the windows, vacuumed the rug, picked up a small silver spoon that had fallen beneath the tea cart. As she stood up, the spoon slipped from her hand. It hit the floor with a sharp metallic clang. Grace froze. So did Lauren. Just for a second, a blink. Not a flinch. Not a twitch. A blink. Grace didn't say a word. She bent down, picked up the spoon and continued cleaning. But inside, something shifted, because in that single moment, she saw something no one else had, and it was only the beginning. Grace didn't sleep much that first week, not because the house was loud, far from it. The King estate was so silent it rang in her ears. No televisions, no laughter, no footsteps in the halls after dark, just the low hum of heat through the vents and the occasional creak of old wood settling under pressure. But her thoughts didn't rest. She kept replaying the moment in the parlor, the clang of the spoon, the blink, the way Lauren's eyelids had moved with something closer to reaction than reflex. It could have meant nothing. She told herself that over and over. Children with sensory loss still had patterns, habits. Blinking could happen, but something about that moment didn't sit quietly inside her. Something about that little girl's stillness felt practiced. Grace knew about quiet. Her own silence had been earned the hard way. Just 9 months earlier, she'd buried her younger brother, Marcus. Shot in broad daylight during a walk home from his part-time job in Harlem, caught in something that had nothing to do with him, just in the wrong place, the wrong breath, the wrong second. He was 17. Grace had raised him more than their mother ever had. He was her joy, her reason to stay steady. And losing him had carved something out of her chest that hadn't filled since. After the funeral, she couldn't breathe in the city anymore. Too many sirens, too many familiar faces asking if she was okay. She packed a single suitcase, closed her bank account, and left. And now she was here, living in a mansion with locked doors, distant staff, and a little girl who blinked at the sound of a spoon. Grace wasn't looking to solve anything. She wasn't looking to be a hero. But something in her had started to listen. On her third day, she passed Lauren in the hallway. It was early afternoon. The child was being led from the parlor to her room by one of the staff, a woman named Judith, who barely spoke above a whisper. Lauren didn't seem to react to the change in space. Her steps were light, deliberate, as though memorized. But as Grace walked past them, carrying folded linens, she noticed something. Lauren's head turned, slightly, not toward the direction of movement, not toward Judith, toward her. It was subtle, the barest tilt of the chin, but Grace saw it, and her chest tightened again. She kept walking. Later that night, she opened her small notebook and wrote one sentence. She turned toward me. Jonathan remained distant. Their conversations were short, functional. He asked if she was adjusting well, if she found the kitchen adequate, if she needed anything. He never asked about Lauren. Not directly, but Grace caught him watching sometimes. Not her, Lauren. During breakfast, he would sit at the head of the long oak table, his hands folded, eyes on his daughter as she picked at her food in silence. He never rushed her, never scolded, just watched. There was love in his eyes, yes, but there was something else too. Fear, like he was afraid to hope. Grace understood that. Hope was dangerous when it came too late. On the fourth evening, Grace was organizing laundry when she passed the open door of Lauren's room. The child sat cross-legged on the floor, bear in hand facing the window. The sun was low, casting golden streaks across the carpet. Grace paused, not intruding, just taking in the picture. Lauren's face was bathed in light, her eyes wide open. She didn't blink, she didn't turn. But something about the way she held her head, angled into the sunlight, made Grace's stomach knot. She watched for a few seconds longer, then stepped away. That night she added a second note to her journal. She faces the light, not away from it, into it. By the end of the week, the routine had settled. Grace woke at 6:30, made coffee, tidied the guest lounge, cleaned the staircases, polished the brass light fixtures that no one ever touched. Lauren's schedule remained fixed. Breakfast at 8 Oka, story time at 9:30, sensory therapy at 11, lunch, rest, then quiet hours in the parlor until dinner. And every day, she sat in that green velvet chair, bear in hand, eyes open, still, too still. On Friday afternoon, Grace took a different route back from the laundry room. She passed behind the parlor, staying quiet as she moved. She stepped lightly on the hardwood floor. No creaks, no bumps. When she rounded the corner, she paused behind the doorway. Lauren was there, of course. Grace took one silent step into the room, and Lauren's head turned, not all the way, just an inch, but directly toward her. Grace said nothing, moved again, to the other side of the room. Lauren turned again, not sharply, not like she saw Grace, more like she felt something, or sensed it. Grace's pulse quickened. She stood still, waited. Lauren didn't speak, didn't move again. But her eyes, they followed. Grace slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, not to record, just to check the time. The screen lit up, bright, white, and for a moment, just a flash, Lauren's pupils shifted toward the glow. It was almost imperceptible, but Grace didn't imagine it. She knew she didn't. That night, Grace didn't sleep at all. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, the old notebook open, her pen trembling slightly as she wrote, "She responds to light." Eyes track motion. Then she circled one word. Light. She stared at it for a long time. What if the doctors were wrong? What if the diagnosis had never been true? Or worse, what if something had changed, and no one had noticed? She didn't say anything. Not to Jonathan. Not to Judith. Not yet. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a question. And Grace Ellison had never been able to ignore a question once it started whispering, especially not one that began with a child's silent eyes and ended with the possibility that everything she'd been told was a lie. The first time Grace saw her smile, it wasn't a smile at all. It was something smaller. A flicker at the corner of the girl's mouth, a twitch, a breath of expression gone as quickly as it appeared. It happened on a Monday afternoon. The sunlight had fallen in long diagonal bands across the parlor floor. Lauren sat in her usual chair, red dress folded neatly around her knees, the bear pressed against her chest. Grace had just finished dusting the nearby shelves when she leaned down to tie her shoelace and sneezed. A sudden, sharp burst, unexpected even to herself, and Lauren shifted. Not her body, not her head, just her mouth. A twitch, the barest lift. Grace blinked. Was that? She straightened, waiting for another sign, but Lauren had already settled again, motionless, expressionless, still. But Grace wasn't. Inside her, the questions had grown roots. That evening, she walked the grounds alone. The estate stretched far behind the house, stone paths, hedged mazes, a greenhouse no one used. It was beautiful in a cold, curated way, like a place meant to be admired, not lived in. She carried her notebook in her pocket, fingers brushing its cover. Each day she'd added to it. Lauren turns toward sound. Lauren reacts to light. Lauren shows facial movement in response to stimuli, but none of it proved anything. Still, Grace didn't need proof yet. She needed patterns, and Lauren was starting to show them. The next day, she tried something new, nothing dramatic, just careful observation. She entered the parlor mid-morning with her usual quiet steps, pretending to dust the piano. She took out her phone under the pretense of checking the time, letting the flashlight flicker for a brief second. Lauren didn't move, but her eyes flinched, just slightly. Grace repeated the action later, near the bookshelf. Same result. That night. Eyes react to directional light. No body movement but ocular motion observed. She underlined it twice. The next evening, she lingered in the hallway outside Lauren's room while Judith led the child to bed. As they passed, Grace softly cleared her throat. Lauren's head turned. Not much, but enough. It happened again 2 days later. Grace tapped a drawer shut just a little too hard, and Lauren blinked quickly, her hands tightening around the bear. She was responding, not dramatically, not consistently, but enough to crack the surface. Still, Grace said nothing. She wasn't ready, not until she was sure. Jonathan remained distant, barely present. He drifted from room to room like a man living beside his own life. Once Grace passed him in the hallway and saw him holding a framed photo of his wife. His thumb ran along the edge of the glass like he was tracing her memory. He looked up. Their eyes met for half a second. Then he nodded politely and moved on. It was the most human moment she'd seen from him yet. Grace began adjusting her routine, not to spy, just to listen. She watched how the staff moved around Lauren, carefully, distantly. No one touched her unless absolutely necessary. No one asked questions. It was as if they'd all accepted Lauren's world as closed, but Grace didn't believe that anymore. One afternoon, she brought in a new cleaning tool, a long-handled feather duster with a soft bell attached to the end. It wasn't meant to be a test, but when she passed behind Lauren's chair and the bell gave a light tink, the girl's head shifted. Grace froze, waited. Lauren's head turned again, more deliberately this time, toward the sound. Grace said nothing, kept dusting. That night, bell test successful. Sound directionality confirmed. Her pulse quickened as she wrote. But it wasn't until she caught Lauren whispering that she truly stopped breathing. It was Wednesday, just past noon. Grace had stepped into the hallway outside Lauren's room to grab fresh towels. As she passed the half-open door, she heard something. Not a noise. A voice. Soft, barely audible. She paused, listened. Sitting cross-legged on the rug, bare in lap, speaking in a breathy hush. Grace couldn't make out the words. They weren't clear, but they were real. She stood there for what felt like an hour, then slowly backed away. She didn't write anything that night. She just sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror, whispering the words, "She can speak." By the end of the week, Grace was certain. There was something in Lauren the world had missed, not broken, not absent, buried, and someone had buried it. She didn't know how or why, but she intended to find out. Late Friday evening, Grace entered the downstairs bathroom, the one near Lauren's bedroom, rarely used. She was cleaning under the sink when she noticed them, 4 small prescription bottles tucked behind the towels. Eye drops, each labeled with the name, Dr. Edwin Reeve. She turned one over. Expiration date was recent. The dosage was unusually high. Grace squinted at the ingredients. She didn't recognize them, but one word on the warning label caught her breath. Photoreceptor suppression. She Googled the compound in secret, huddled under her blankets. Side effects included visual dulling, light sensitivity, developmental delay. Her stomach flipped. What were these doing in the bathroom of a blind child? And why were they still being used? She returned the bottles carefully, heart racing. The next morning she made a decision. Just one test. Not cruel, not risky, just a chance. If she was wrong, nothing would happen. But if she was right, it could change everything. She found Lauren alone in the parlor again, sitting in the slant of morning light. Grace knelt slowly beside her. "Hey," she whispered. No response. She took out her phone, flicked on the flashlight, held it gently in front of Lauren's face. Nothing. She moved it left, then right. Lauren's eyes tracked, not clearly, not sharply, but they moved. Grace felt her breath catch. Then, like a whisper against the glass, Lauren spoke. 3 words, barely audible, but they shattered Grace's entire world. "I see light." For a moment, neither of them moved. Grace knelt there, frozen, the beam of her phone's flashlight still steady in the air. Lauren's eyes were wide, pupils dilated, lips parted. "I see light." 3 soft words, but in that still parlor they struck like thunder. Grace didn't breathe. She watched the girl's face, waiting, hoping, terrified she'd imagined it. But Lauren was still looking at the light. Her hand, slow and tentative, rose from her lap. Fingers hovered in the air like she was trying to reach it, then lowered again. Grace turned off the flashlight. Lauren blinked, then silence. Back to stillness. The moment passed, but the meaning didn't. Grace stood slowly, her knees shaking. She walked out of the parlor without a word. That night, she didn't write in her notebook. She couldn't. Her hands trembled too much. She sat at her desk, with the pen clutched tight, pages blank, eyes red. She'd seen it, heard it. There was no question anymore. Lauren wasn't blind, not completely. Or if she had been once, she wasn't now. And yet the eye drops kept coming. The same ones, the same labels, same dosages. Grace hadn't seen anyone administer them directly, but the bottles kept moving. One day they were full, the next half empty. Someone was still using them. And Grace had a sinking feeling about who. She began skipping the drops during her cleaning rounds, not permanently, just 1 or 2. She wanted to see what would happen, if the light in Lauren's eyes was a fluke or a flame. By the 3rd day, she had her answer. It was afternoon. Rain had just passed through, leaving the windows streaked and the house shadowed. Grace entered the parlor with a small flashlight hidden in her pocket. Lauren sat in her usual chair, the red dress swapped now for a soft lavender one. Not loud, not clear, humming. Just a low, tuneless murmur, like a memory wrapped in cotton. Grace paused. The girl had never made a sound around her before. She pulled out the flashlight, clicked it on. Lauren's head turned, this time, fully. Her eyes followed the beam as it traced the wall, then back again. And her lips moved. "Bear," she whispered. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She turned the light off. Lauren blinked twice, slowly, then curled deeper into the chair and hugged her Bear tight. Grace walked straight to the downstairs bathroom and opened the cabinet. She counted the bottles. 3 now. 1 was gone. She checked the trash. Nothing. She checked the kitchen bin. Nothing. Gone without a trace. She closed the cabinet and looked at herself in the mirror. The same eyes, but a different woman. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was evidence. That night, Grace searched Dr. Edwin Reeve again. Her phone lit up with articles she hadn't seen before, buried deeper, less public. One reported a malpractice claim sealed 5 years ago. Another mentioned a private research study on pediatric neurodevelopmental suppression. Both had been scrubbed from most databases, but the fragments remained. High-dosage compounds, vision pathway suppression, limited peer review. Grace's chest tightened. She leaned back in her bed and stared at the ceiling, whispering Marcus's name like a prayer. Then Lauren's. She wasn't imagining this. The girl had been seeing. The girl had spoken. Someone had buried that truth. And whoever it was, had started the moment she was born. The next morning, Grace found herself face to face with Jonathan in the hallway. He was leaving his study, coffee in hand. He looked exhausted. They nearly collided. "Apologies," he said stiffly. "No worries," Grace replied, stepping aside. But she didn't move on. Not immediately. She watched him walk away, tall and hollow-eyed, like a man moving out of instinct rather than intention. Did he know, or had he trusted a doctor once and never questioned it again? Was he keeping Lauren in the dark, or was he in the dark too? Grace didn't know, but she was starting to understand one thing. The girl's blindness wasn't a condition. It was a decision. That afternoon, Grace entered the parlor again with a plan. She brought a toy, a small cat figurine with a blinking red light in its collar. She set it on the floor, several feet away from Lauren's chair. Lauren sat quietly, bare in lap. Grace knelt beside the toy, angled the beam slightly upward, clicked it on. Red light, small but bright. Lauren didn't move, not at first. Then her eyes shifted, slowly. Then her head. She leaned forward, just an inch. Then whispered, "Red." Grace clapped a hand to her mouth. Tears welled instantly. "Red," Lauren repeated, softer this time, as if trying to remember the word as she said it. Grace turned the toy off. Lauren blinked again, then turned toward Grace for the first time. Not blindly, directly. And for a second, just a second, she smiled. That night, Grace left her notebook open on the desk. She wrote only one line. She sees. But what terrified her most wasn't the truth. It was what came next. Because if Lauren could see light, if she could name color, if her blindness was being induced, then someone had done this to her. Someone had made sure she stayed in the dark. And Grace was getting closer to uncovering why. Grace had always trusted her instincts. She hadn't grown up with luxuries or lifelines. What kept her safe, what got her through, was the ability to read a room before anyone spoke, to see the truth before it was spoken out loud. And now that instinct was screaming. Lauren wasn't just responding to light. She was identifying it, following it, naming it. The pieces no longer looked like questions. They looked like a map. All Grace had to do now was follow it. She started with the medication. The eye drops had been easy to overlook at first. Unlabeled bottles shoved behind folded towels, beige caps, faded text. But now that she knew what she was looking for, everything about them felt wrong. On Monday morning, while Judith was running errands, Grace returned to the downstairs bathroom. She pulled open the cabinet and counted again. 2 bottles, only 2. She reached behind the towels and found another, empty. Grace held it up to the light. The label had a crease through the middle, but the name was still visible. Dr. Edwin Reeve. Underneath, in smaller print, dosage, 4 eggs daily. Visual suppression therapy, not for long-term pediatric use. Her fingers froze over those last 5 words. Not for long-term pediatric use. But the dates on the bottle told a different story. Prescribed 11 months ago, refilled 5 times. Grace checked the trash bins again. Still nothing. Someone was disposing of them carefully. Quietly. She slipped the bottle into her jacket pocket. Back in her room, she opened her laptop and searched the compound again. This time she went deeper. Medical journals, clinical trial registries, blacklisted pharmaceutical pages. And there it was. A 2016 article buried in an archived database. A summary of an early trial using the same compound in pediatric patients diagnosed with cortical visual impairment. The headline, Experimental Light Suppression Therapy, Preliminary Risks and Ethical Red Flags. The article was blunt. In high doses, the compound may inhibit neural responses to visual stimuli, leading to prolonged developmental delay or artificial blindness in non-congenitally blind patients. Artificial blindness. Her hands shook as she scrolled. Dr. Edwin Reeve's name was listed at the top. Principal researcher. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, staring out into the blackness of the estate grounds, trying to fit it all together. Lauren's silence, Jonathan's grief, the diagnosis that had never been questioned, the doctor no one talked about, the eye drops. She needed confirmation, real professional confirmation, and she knew exactly where to get it. The next day, she waited until the house was quiet. Early evening, after dinner, when Lauren was in her room and Jonathan had retreated to his study, she took one of the full drop bottles and slid it into a Ziploc bag. Then she texted her friend Celeste. Celeste worked nights in a hospital lab in Manhattan. They hadn't spoken in months, not since Marcus. But Grace trusted her. She didn't explain much, just that she needed the compound analyzed. Quietly. No questions asked. Celeste responded within minutes. "Drop it off tomorrow, I won't log it." Grace exhaled, the knot in her chest loosening only slightly. She caught the early train the next morning and returned before anyone noticed she'd left. That night, she stood in the hallway outside Lauren's door listening to the girl's breathing, steady, soft, alive. And she whispered, "We're going to fix this." Not out loud, just in her mind. But it felt like a promise. 2 days later, Celeste called. She didn't say hello, just, "Grace, what the hell did you give me?" Grace's heart dropped. "Why?" "There are 2 different compounds in that drop. One's a corticosteroid, the other, God, I had to double-check it, it's a neuroinhibitor. The kind they use in early trials for seizure suppression and more controversial stuff." "Like what?" "Like visual pathway dampening. In extreme cases, it can suppress photoreceptor response." "Grace, this stuff isn't legal for pediatric use in those concentrations. Where did you get it?" Grace swallowed hard. "A child's been using it. Daily. For years." Silence on the line. "Jesus," Celeste whispered. She hung up and sat in the middle of her room, the phone still warm in her hand. This was it. Proof. Chemical. Medical. Undeniable. Now came the harder part. What would she do with it? Jonathan still hadn't said much to her beyond routine politeness. But Grace could feel his eyes on her more now, watching her interactions with Lauren, watching how the girl seemed to move a little more, turn her head, reach for the bear with more intention. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed. Grace wondered, how long had he stopped truly seeing his daughter, and if she told him now, if she dropped the truth into his lap like a lit match, would he believe her, or would he destroy it? She wasn't sure. Not yet. So she waited, watched, and planned. That evening, Lauren sat in the parlor, her red dress pressed around her like a flower. The flashlight toy was in her lap. She turned it on herself, watched it blink, smiled faintly, then turned it off. Grace stood in the doorway, motionless. The girl turned toward her, directly. No delay, and Grace finally spoke. "Do you like the red one best?" Lauren nodded. Then, for the first time, she spoke a full sentence. "I like yellow better." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Yellow, a color, a preference, a choice. She knelt beside her, eyes filling with quiet tears. "Me too," she whispered. Lauren smiled again, this time fully, and the light outside the window grew just a little warmer. But the truth Grace now held in her pocket, the bottle, the lab report, the name on the label, didn't come with warmth. It came with weight, because someone had done this. Someone had prescribed suppression instead of vision, silence instead of hope, and Grace was finally ready to name him. Dr. Edwin Reeve. The air inside the King estate felt different that morning. Not louder, not busier, but more awake. Grace felt it in the way the sun filtered through the windows, no longer cold, but golden. In the way Lauren moved, no longer drifting, but deliberate. Something was shifting, not just in the child, but in the walls themselves. As if the house, long sealed shut, had started breathing again. And Grace knew it was time. She couldn't keep this to herself any longer. Jonathan was in the study when she knocked. He didn't answer at first. She turned the knob gently and stepped in. He sat at the far end of the room, bathed in the soft blue light of a muted computer screen. Papers were stacked neatly in front of him. His fingers rested on a closed file, but he wasn't reading. He was just staring. "Mr. King," she said softly. He blinked, looked up. "Grace," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Is something wrong?" She stepped closer. She said, "But something's not right." He sat back in his chair, studying her. She held up the drop bottle. The label was barely legible, but the name was clear. Dr. Edwin Reeve, she said. You recognize it? His expression shifted, slight, controlled. Yes, he said. He's Lauren's original pediatric ophthalmologist. Are you still following his treatment plan? Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Why are you asking me that? Because this, she said, holding out a printed copy of the lab results, was analyzed by a hospital lab in Manhattan, and the compounds in it are doing more than just maintaining her condition. They're suppressing it. His face paled. Suppressing what? Light response, neural stimulation, cognitive visual engagement. Jonathan, your daughter may not be blind. Silence. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on her like a man watching a building fall. That's impossible, he said, almost to himself. She was diagnosed at birth. MRI confirmed. She reacted to light, Grace interrupted gently. To color. She spoke, not words she memorized, new words, about things she was seeing. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. You've been testing her? No, Grace said. I've been watching her, listening, and when I stopped giving her the drops for a few days, everything changed. Jonathan's voice cracked. You stopped her medication? Grace didn't move. Yes. He stepped back, eyes blazing. You had no right. I had every right, she said quietly, when I realized something was hurting her. They stared at each other. Two people from two broken worlds, standing in the eye of a truth neither wanted, but both could no longer avoid. That night, the house was too quiet. Lauren had gone to bed early. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, her notebook open but untouched. The page read, Day 17, light, color, voice. She heard the knock just after 10. She opened the door to find Jonathan standing there, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his face more hollow than she'd ever seen it. I want to see it, he said. What? He looked up, eyes rimmed red. Whatever you saw, I want to see it too. They waited until morning. The light was softer then, clearer, no shadows, no interference. Lauren was already in the parlor, her bear in her lap. Grace knelt beside her. Jonathan stood just behind, hands trembling at his sides. Lauren, Grace whispered, do you remember what we practiced? Lauren turned toward her. No hesitation. Yes. Grace pulled out her flashlight. Can you tell me what this is? Lauren squinted as the light passed gently across her face. A light, she whispered. Then, a moment later, stronger. Yellow. Jonathan made a sound behind them, choked, disbelieving. Grace turned the light off. Lauren blinked. Then she spoke again. Mommy? Grace froze. Jonathan staggered forward, eyes wide, chest heaving. He dropped to his knees beside his daughter. Lauren turned. For the first time, she looked at him. And then, slowly, tentatively, she stood. Her steps were unsteady, but clear. She walked, straight into his arms. Jonathan collapsed into her, arms around her tiny frame, shaking with silent sobs. She's never, he stammered. She's never done that. Not once. Lauren curled against his chest like she'd done it every day. Grace stepped back, tears in her eyes. This wasn't proof in a file. It was proof in flesh, in light, in movement. Jonathan looked up, his voice raw. What happened to her? Grace told him everything, the blinking, the sounds, the light, the missing bottles, the dosage, the research, the call from Celeste, the warning on the label. She told him about the color, the smile, and the name on the prescription, Dr. Edwin Reeve. Jonathan didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he sat still for a long time, holding his daughter close. Then, finally, he whispered 4 words. Stop the drops, now. The next day, the mansion felt different. Not louder, not brighter, but lighter. Lauren turned her head at the sound of footsteps now. She reached for the curtains and pulled them open on her own. She laughed, quietly, but laughed when Grace brought her a toy with a spinning yellow light. She smiled when Jonathan picked her up, and once, just once, she ran, through the hall, barefoot, laughing, Jonathan couldn't stop watching her. He sat on the stairs that night, hands over his face, whispering to no one. I didn't know. Grace sat beside him. She's still here, she said. He nodded. She always was. But Grace couldn't rest yet, because now that they knew, they had to ask the hardest question of all: why? Why would a doctor prescribe visual suppressants to a child who might have seen? Why keep her in the dark? Why lie? And who else had known? The drops had stopped, but the damage might not be over. Grace looked at Lauren, now drawing suns with yellow crayons, and realized the truth had only just begun to surface. Jonathan didn't leave his study for 3 days, not because he was hiding, but because he was working. Stacks of medical records lay open across his desk, some faded with time, others newly printed. Grace found him there each morning, red-eyed and silent, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside him. He barely spoke, but he was reading. Every document, every note from the first year of Lauren's life, every communication with Dr. Edwin Reeve. He was searching for something, anything, he'd missed. Grace kept watch over Lauren. Without the drops, the changes came faster. She reached for objects more confidently, followed Grace across a room, pointed at shapes in books, and sometimes, usually near the window, she'd smile quietly and whisper, "Yellow, that's the sun." Jonathan cried the first time he heard it. Not a loud cry, just a breath that broke mid-chest. On the 4th day, he called Grace into the study. She found him standing in front of the bookshelf, holding a file. His hands were shaking. "I found it," he said. She stepped closer. He opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, correspondence from 7 years ago, dozens of messages between Jonathan and Dr. Reeve during the first month after Lauren's birth. One stood out. Subject: Cortical Conditioning Program, Optional Edition. Jonathan pointed. "I never responded to this email. I barely even remember reading it. Allison had just died. I was numb." Grace scanned the message. Dr. Reeve had outlined a therapy protocol, experimental supplements, designed to soothe cortical overstimulation in children with suspected optic underdevelopment. In small print, side effects may include delayed visual reflexes or sensory dulling. Long-term results still under review. Jonathan dropped the file on the desk. "I trusted him," he said. "He came highly recommended. Everyone said he was a visionary. Cutting edge." Grace kept reading. There were follow-ups from Reeve, some friendly, some clinical. None questioned Jonathan's silence. Reeve simply started the prescriptions, and Jonathan, buried in grief, followed the refills blindly. They contacted a new pediatric ophthalmologist in Boston the following week, Dr. Eliza Martin, highly regarded, specialized in misdiagnosed cortical visual impairment. She agreed to a private consultation after Jonathan sent the lab analysis. They took Lauren 2 days later. The ride was long. Lauren sat quietly in the back seat, holding her bear and watching the trees blur past. For the first time, her eyes didn't just stare into space. They tracked, shifted, watched. Dr. Martin ran a full battery of tests: visual tracking, light response, neural imaging. Lauren cooperated beautifully. She laughed when the testing device beeped, pointed to the brightest dot on the screen, even followed Grace with her eyes across the room. When it was over, Dr. Martin sat down across from Jonathan and Grace. Her expression was soft but serious. "She's not fully blind," she said. "Her optic nerves were underdeveloped at birth, yes, but not inactive, not destroyed." Jonathan gripped the edge of the chair. "She could have seen?" he asked. "With intervention, possibly. Therapy. Stimulation. Instead." She paused. "This child has been under pharmacological suppression for nearly her entire developmental window. Someone intentionally shut down her visual processing." Grace's hands tightened into fists. "Can it be reversed?" Jonathan asked, his voice shaking. Dr. Martin hesitated. "Some of it, yes. She's already showing signs of recovery. But the longer the brain goes unexposed to sensory input, the harder it is to regain full function. You've got a window now, but it's closing." They drove back in silence. Lauren fell asleep against Grace's shoulder. Jonathan watched the road, jaw tight, knuckles white on the wheel. When they returned, he went straight to the study. Grace followed. He opened his laptop, pulled up an article he'd bookmarked that morning. The headline, "Class Action Filed Against Pediatric Researcher Edwin Reeve for Unauthorized Experimental Treatments." Below it, a growing list of names, families, children, stories like Lauren's, delayed development, cognitive suppression, dismissed concerns. Jonathan turned to Grace. "He did this to others," he said. "She's not the only one." Grace nodded. "I know." Over the next few days, Jonathan made calls. Private investigators, lawyers, former colleagues from the board of his company, people with reach, with connections. He found out Reeve had lost his hospital affiliation last year, that he'd relocated his practice under a shell corporation in New Jersey, that 3 complaints had been sealed through private settlements, none had gone to trial. Jonathan's voice shook as he shared each detail. "This wasn't a mistake," he said. "This was a pattern." Grace watched him closely. "You're going after him," she said quietly. He didn't hesitate. "I have to." Meanwhile, Lauren continued to blossom. She reached for crayons now, always yellow first. She asked questions. "What color is the sky? Why does the wind make the trees move? Can I see a butterfly?" She painted pictures, smiles, light. Grace kept everyone. Jonathan started reading to her again, not from memory this time, but aloud, beside her. And Lauren listened. She tilted her head, laughed when he made voices. Once she curled against him and whispered, "You sound like Mommy." He broke into tears. Grace didn't say anything. She just watched and stayed. But not everything was healing. One night, Grace found a message slipped under her door. No envelope, no signature, just 4 words typed on plain white paper. "Stop asking about Reeve." She stood still, the note shaking in her hand. She wasn't afraid, but she was angry. Jonathan burned the note in the fireplace. "They're watching," he said. "Someone's still protecting him." "Then we're getting close," Grace replied. The next morning, the estate was quiet again, but not lifeless. The silence now held weight, not grief, resolve. Because somewhere out there was the man who had stolen Lauren's sight, her words, her early years, and he wasn't going to disappear quietly. Jonathan had built an empire once. He knew how to dismantle one too, and he was ready to begin. It started with a phone call. Jonathan's attorney, an old friend from his corporate days, called on a Tuesday morning with a tight, clipped voice. "Reeve's legal team made contact," he said. "They're nervous. That means we're getting under their skin." Jonathan didn't smile. He simply said, "Good." By that afternoon, a formal complaint had been filed with the state medical board citing unethical treatment, lack of parental consent, and experimental pharmaceutical use on a minor. The documentation included Grace's lab results, Dr. Martin's evaluation, and signed statements from Jonathan and Grace. But Jonathan wasn't interested in complaints. He wanted justice. He wanted truth. And if that meant turning his own name into a headline, he was ready. Word spread faster than they expected. By the end of the week, a reporter from a major East Coast publication left a voicemail on Jonathan's office line. "Mr. King, we've received tips about a potential medical scandal involving your daughter. We'd love to give you a chance to speak on the record." He deleted the message. The second call came the next morning. The third came before lunch. By day's end, 5 different outlets had reached out. Jonathan knew the story was no longer theirs to contain. But inside the house, another kind of story was unfolding. Lauren was changing by the hour. She now walked with open confidence, her steps firmer, more intentional. She explored corners of the estate no one had shown her. She asked questions, not just about colors or sounds, but about people. One afternoon, she pointed to a photo on the hallway wall, an old picture of Jonathan and Allison. "That's Mommy," she said. Jonathan's voice broke when he whispered, "Yes, yes, it is." She turned to Grace. "Is she in the light now?" Grace nodded, barely holding back tears. "She is." They hired a play therapist the next week, a gentle woman named Sophia, who specialized in trauma recovery for children with sensory delay. Sophia brought toys, art supplies, a therapy dog named Moss. Lauren adored all three. She painted suns, fields, and sometimes abstract swirls of yellow and white. But what struck Grace most wasn't what Lauren created. It was how she did it, with intention, with joy, and for the first time, with voice. She laughed. She asked for help. She sang, little made-up tunes that filled the parlor with something the house had never known. Life. Still, darkness wasn't done with them. One night, Grace received a message on her personal phone. Unknown number, no caller ID. The text was short. Back off, or someone else gets hurt. She stared at it for a long time, then forwarded it to Jonathan. He replied with only 2 words: change locks. The next morning, security cameras were installed at every door. Grace didn't ask who Jonathan had called, but 2 unmarked cars now rotated outside the estate, day and night. No one mentioned the text again, but the silence spoke volumes. Despite the growing pressure, Grace kept her routine. She worked in the mornings, helped with Lauren's therapy in the afternoons, and documented everything: Lauren's progress, her reactions, her words. Each entry was careful, dated, precise, and in the back of the journal, Grace wrote 1 line each night. She sees, she lives, she grows. It became a prayer. By the end of the month, Jonathan received a cease and desist letter from Reeves' legal team. It accused Jonathan of defamation, reckless endangerment, and unauthorized medical testing. Jonathan read it once, then shredded it. That night, he sent a signed authorization to his attorney. Full release of Lauren's medical history. Public testimony approved. Grace didn't ask if he was sure. She could see it in his face. He was no longer the man who had retreated into silence after losing Allison. He was now the man ready to raise his voice for his daughter. Meanwhile, Grace received another message. This one wasn't a threat. A closed-door roundtable was an invitation by a children's advocacy foundation. The topic: misdiagnosis and medical suppression in pediatric cases. Grace almost didn't go, but Jonathan encouraged her. So she took a train to Manhattan, walked into the conference room alone. She didn't speak first, or loudly, but when she did, the room went silent. She told Lauren's story, not in medical terms, but human ones. A girl who lived in silence, a bear hugged tight, a blink in the light, a whisper, "I see." When she finished, the woman beside her, another mother, another fighter, reached for her hand. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing her, when no one else did." Grace left with a folder of contacts: legal teams, pediatric researchers, journalists who had been waiting for stories like Lauren's to break the surface. The tide was turning, and Reeve was running out of places to hide. Back at the estate, something else had changed. Jonathan had begun showing up to therapy sessions, not as an observer but as a participant. He helped Lauren paint. He asked her questions. He told her stories about her mother. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the window, Lauren touched his face and whispered, "I remember her laugh." Jonathan didn't speak. He just pulled her close and held her for a long, trembling minute. Grace stood in the doorway, watching them, and for the first time, she let herself believe something she hadn't dared to before. This wasn't just about what had been done to Lauren, it was about what she was becoming now because of what they were fighting for. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Because somewhere out there, Edwin Reeves still had his license, still had his defenders, still had children under his care, and Grace knew, deep in her bones, this wasn't the end. This was the reckoning. The news broke on a Thursday morning. A front-page headline in one of the country's largest papers: "Renowned pediatric specialist under investigation for suppressed vision therapy scandal." Below it, a photo of Edwin Reeve, blurry, hurried, stepping out of a courthouse, his face half shielded, his name now synonymous with something far darker than medicine. Inside the article, buried between legal statements and medical jargon, was a single sentence that changed everything. The case began with a 7-year-old girl named Lauren King and the housekeeper who noticed something no one else did. Within hours, the media storm erupted. TV vans parked outside the gates of the King estate. Talk shows ran segments titled "The Girl Who Could See" and "The Billionaire's Secret Battle." Jonathan ignored every call. Grace turned down every interview. But the story wasn't theirs anymore. It had found its way into the world. And now it belonged to anyone who had ever been silenced, anyone who had ever been told, "This is all you are and all you'll ever be." Dr. Reeve was formally charged a week later. 4 families came forward, then 6, then 9, each with their own version of the same story: high-dosage prescriptions, vague diagnoses, children who regressed under treatment rather than grew. Jonathan watched the news with his arms around Lauren. She didn't understand the full weight of what was happening, but she understood one thing: she wasn't in the dark anymore. They flew to Washington, D.C. 2 weeks later. Grace had been invited to speak at a children's resilience conference, this time on record. She wore a navy dress and her grandmother's silver cross. Lauren came too. She wore yellow. The room was packed. Parents, doctors, advocates, journalists. Grace stepped up to the podium with shaking hands. She didn't read from a speech. She didn't need to. "I was just the maid," she said, her voice clear. "I wasn't trained in diagnostics. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I watched, I listened. And what I saw changed everything." She told them about Lauren, about the bear, the blink, the first word, light, about the drops, the lie, the truth beneath it. "She wasn't broken," Grace said. "She was buried, and someone needed to dig her out." When she stepped down, the room rose to its feet. But Grace didn't hear the applause. She only heard the voice behind her. "Yellow," Lauren whispered, pointing to the stage lights. "Like the sun." That summer, Lauren started school for the first time. Not special education, not home tutoring, a real classroom. The first day, she clutched Grace's hand tightly. Her backpack was too big. Her bear was tucked inside. But when they reached the door, Lauren let go. She walked in alone. And when the teacher asked the children to pick a crayon and share their favorite color, Lauren didn't hesitate. She held up a bright yellow one and said, loud and proud, "This one's my favorite." The story didn't disappear. Not completely. Jonathan was asked to speak on panels about medical oversight. He declined everyone. Instead, he funded a grant that now supports visual rehabilitation programs for children nationwide. He named it after his wife, Allison. Grace still lives at the estate, but not as a maid. She and Jonathan share guardianship of Lauren now, an agreement filed quietly without fanfare, and finalized on Lauren's 8th birthday. When the judge asked if Grace would like to make a statement, she said only, "She's not mine, she's ours, but I'll fight for her like she is." Sometimes Grace still walks the halls at night. Old habits die hard. But now, the silence in the house doesn't feel heavy. It feels full, of light, of life, of laughter. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Lauren asked a question. "Why was it dark for so long?" Jonathan started to answer, but Grace spoke first. "Because some people were afraid of what would happen if you saw the truth." Lauren nodded, thoughtful, then said, "I'm not afraid." And she wasn't. Not anymore. In a sunlit room at the back of the house, Lauren paints, brush in one hand, bear by her side. She paints stars, flowers, skies. But always, always, she starts with yellow. Because yellow, she once said, feels like the sun. She pauses, looks out the window, lifts her hand toward the light, fingers spread wide, and smiles. Not because she sees perfectly, but because now she sees clearly. And finally, so does the world.